Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Les damos la bienvenida a esta mesa redonda que hemos organizado con motivo del número especial de la revista Hola Financiera, que tiene que ver con, bueno, que hemos titulado como Bancos Públicos, Agua Pública, y que tiene que ver justamente con el financiamiento de proyectos de agua a partir de justamente instituciones bancarias públicas. Eh, Eh, bien, hoy nos acompaña la doctora Susan Sprung, que nos hará una presentación, ¿no? En torno justamente a este tema, y nos comentarán la doctora Mónica Meireles y el doctor Wesley Marshall. Entonces les iré presentando a cada uno a medida que van participando, comenzando por la doctora Susan Sprung, que es profesora asociada en la Escuela de Desarrollo Internacional y Estudios Globales. Su investigación se centra en el impacto del neoliberalismo en la transformación del Estado y los servicios públicos en el sur global. Actualmente es co-solicitante en un proyecto financiado por la SSHRC, que se centra en el papel de los bancos públicos en el logro de los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible, en particular las metas sobre agua y saneamiento. Sus proyectos anteriores, financiados por esta misma institución, incluyeron un estudio del impacto de los sistemas de transferencia de efectivo en el empoderamiento de las mujeres, en el contexto de las transiciones post-racializadas, capitalistas en Sudáfrica y Bolivia, y un estado sobre la democracia local y el servicio de reparto de agua en Bolivia y Venezuela, 2011-2015. Es investigadora asociada del proyecto de servicios municipales que se centra en alternativas de políticas en la prestación de servicios municipales en África, Asia y América Latina, y también es cofundadora del Blended Finance Project, una coalición de organizaciones de la sociedad civil, sindicatos y académicos que desean brindar a los canadienses una imagen más completa de las finanzas combinadas en la política de ayuda exterior canadiense. Bueno, sin más, le damos la palabra a la doctora Sprung.
Hola. Ah, Quisiera comenzar a agradecer Wesley y su equipo por la traducción del trabajo que hemos hecho. I am going to speak in English and do so slowly. I do speak and understand Spanish, but I do not speak Spanish frequently in Canada, so I'm a little rusty. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you and to speak English. I understand the comments are going to be in Spanish. If I have trouble, I'll ask one of you to help, and please feel free to ask any questions in Spanish. So what I'm going to be doing in the next 20 minutes or so is giving an overview of some of the
Sorry,
themes.
Susan,
Yeah,
can you put your screen on full screen,
yes,
please?
I'll try that. I think what I need to do is play from start. There, is
Yes.
that better?
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, great,
Great.
thank you.
No problem. Thank you for that. So just a little bit about this project and about me before I begin. This is a project that I have been working on with my comrades, Tom Merwa and Dave McDonald, who have just left Mexico City this morning. I couldn't join you in person, so I'm really happy to be here on Zoom with you. We've been working on this project together for the last few years. I have worked on the questions of water and sanitation for my career. And I've worked in Bolivia, Peru, Argentina, Ecuador, Costa Rica, France, South Africa. The work that I'm going to be talking about to you today are the Latin American case studies that are in the translation of the Ola Financiera Special Edition. And to let you know that I come to these questions more as a water person who's learning about public banks. And the reason why we've decided to focus more on financing is because a question that we often confront when we're talking about public water is, where is the money going to come from? It's often seen as a barrier in terms of trying to achieve the SDG 6, the water target, which aims for universal access to water and sanitation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we did this research, talk about an overview of some of the case studies from Latin America and the Caribbean, present some cautionary notes and promising findings that the research that we did for the recent book, some of the case studies are in the Ola Financiera, the ones on Latin America again. And I'm going to spotlight one of the banks, which I think is they're all interesting, but I'm going to highlight the bank in Colombia because there's some interesting findings there in terms of what the bank achieved during the COVID times to restructure itself. And I do not have updates, but maybe there's someone in the room who can tell us what's happening with the new government, because one of the things that's really important about this case study is starting to open up towards smaller credits to support community-based water management, which is also another topic that I've worked on for decades now. And tell a little bit about the next steps in terms of what needs to happen for future research. And I look forward to hearing the comments, and thank you in advance as well to both Monica and Wesley. So we decided to do this research because there's an amazing hole in the literature. There's a lack of research on public banks. This is true in Canada, it's true in Mexico. Public banks fell out of view. They're experiencing a resurgence now as states look for ways to address intractable development problems. But to give an example of recent work that I've been doing a survey of the literature on financing for development, looking at the question of gender transformation. And I have only found a couple of references to public banks in at least 120 articles, peer-reviewed books, gray literature, policy papers. So again, there's a deafening silence on public banks, and we are convinced that we need to think more about what these organizations are and know more about them, because they do offer potential to help us finance important questions, finance important initiatives, including infrastructure such as water and sanitation, especially given the fact that most of the people in the world who have access to a formal water supply are provided by a public company. So we decided to explore these links between public banks and public water because of this dearth and these questions. And one of the things I will talk about in terms of the promising findings is that when we looked at different case studies, including the ones in Latin America that are included in the special issue of Ola Financiera, we see that there's a lot of public collaborations already happening amongst different public entities, different financial entities, governments. There's a potential for a lot more. For me, this question is also, at the end of the day, not just about finance, but we need to ask ourselves, why are we doing this? I'm a professor. I frequently ask myself, why am I spending my time doing this research rather than other research I could be doing with other global problems? I will point out that dirty water remains a very important public health issue. And this is the latest data that I could access from the World Health Organization in terms of the diseases that kill most people in the world. Of course, in 2021, number one at the top of the list was COVID-19, a new virus. And then we see a bunch of non-communicable diseases, heart disease, stroke, respiratory infections, complications from birth, neck pain, back pain, diabetes, pulmonary disease. But number 9, diarrheal diseases are related directly to dirty water. These are diseases that can be prevented with proper public hygiene, and water and sanitation, and public water and sanitation that is high quality and accessible is part of that story. We also know that this is the kind of global political problem that can be fixed. There are low-cost technological solutions to many of these problems, and it's about getting the right people to make the right decisions about investing in this very important public health issue by providing universal access to water and sanitation. So here are a couple of books that we recently have published. I was involved on the left hand of the screen, you'll see a book, which is a collection of some of the European case studies, some of which also appear in the special edition. I am the author of one of the case studies in this book on France, where we looked at a public water company in Paris, which went under a remunicipalization process. It's a very famous case study because it was one of the first remunicipalizations in France and also was put shockwaves through the water world. But what I'm mostly going to talk about today is the work that we've done, which is represented in the book on the right, the case studies on Latin America. I had the privilege of being the editor and working with the authors who wrote the 4 case studies on Latin America. And they're most likely the most relevant for those of you in the room today, because of course there's potential for collaboration and learning amongst these different public banks. And I've understood from my colleagues that you've also had active participation in the previous 2 days at a conference that took place on Monday and Tuesday from Bancos, for example. And so it's great to see these collaborations and this learning and exchange happening. So in the book that we are publishing, it's coming out in February. There are 9 case studies total. 4 of them are for Latin America, and that already tells you something. One of the great reasons that I love working on Latin America is it is really a laboratory for social innovation. Of course, we've seen swings in the government from the left to the right, from right to left. But it is a place where we see, compared to other regions in the world, still very strong public banks because of the history of state provision, and also some tendencies and traditions of social democratic government that have persisted in places like Costa Rica, Brazil, of course, Argentina, and now newly Colombia. And I am going to talk about the Findeter Bank because of some of the decisions it's made more recently to expand the services that it is providing. That is, services meaning cheap credit, which is basically what, if you want to have one sentence that summarizes what a public bank can provide to people, it is cheap credit. So I'm going to talk about Findeter, which is the bank that's featured in the chapter on Colombia. We also did a case study on Fonplata, which is a regional bank owned by the countries that surround the Rio de la Plata region. So that case study is from Buenos Aires in Argentina. We also have a case study on Brazil, which looks at the changes in government from Bolsonaro back to Lula, and then Lula, Bolsonaro, and back to Lula again, and what that's meant for public water operators in the northeast of Brazil. And the 2 banks that we look at in that chapter are Bendes, which is probably one of the world's most famous and largest public development banks, and the Caixa, which is another Brazilian bank. And then Costa Rica, which is one of Tom and my favorites, one of my co-editors and I favorite public banks. I had the privilege of going to Costa Rica to do research on the Banco Popular, which is the world's most democratic public bank in our estimation. And that chapter looks at the relationship between that bank and community water operators. But let's talk about the big picture. And this is simply a presentation of the Latin American case studies, Latin American and Caribbean case studies in the book and also featured in the Ola Financiera. So, cautionary notes. And here we're going to go to the big picture, drawing some basic lessons from the case studies that we did, the 9 case studies from across the regions, meaning Africa, Middle East, and North Africa, Asia, and Europe as well, and Latin America. So one of the debates in financing for development is this question of what is the role of a bank versus what is the role of the national treasury? In other words, when is it important for a government to simply directly invest in something to build infrastructure? Or when do we need public banks to come in and provide accessible financing that is longer term financing that has to be paid back over a number of years? One of the things that we emphasize in this book, in this collection, is that public banks cannot do it alone, and that while there's a role of public banks, other instruments of financing are often more suitable when we're talking about very poor and marginalized communities in which a grant form of financing is preferable, or directly investing. And to give you one example, that is direct fiscal transfers. Give you an example from where I am coming from. I'm joining you today from Ottawa, Canada, so the capital of Canada. Canada has almost universal water provision. However, there are a number of First Nations communities in Canada that do not have access to potable water, including a community that is around an hour's drive from my house, just north of here. It's a community, it's a reserve called Kitigan-Zibi. Only 40% of the people in that community have access to a safe water supply. Now, one of the things that were debates in Canada, and this is probably relevant for you in Mexico as well, where you face constraints and demands from communities that do not have access to adequate financing, is there's a demand from communities for the government just to simply invest. Because once you are involving a public bank, it is a loan, it needs to be paid back with an interest rate. So again, that's one of the questions that we always need to be asking ourselves is what is that line between when is the public bank be involved or when should the government invest directly? One of the things that we emphasize in this book is that public banks cannot do it alone, that governments have to be involved as well in financing infrastructure. One of the other things that we found in the case studies is that there's often a lack of coordination between the public banks and governments. This can lead to inefficiencies, of course, where different entities are doing different things. And that is something that we always need to be thinking about in terms of coordinating with government. One of the things that we saw in the Costa Rica case study are bureaucratic delays. So overly bureaucratic processes within public banks can cause delays and even push water operators to private lenders. And so they're looking often for simply access to credits. And this was the case for the small community water operators that we were interviewing in Costa Rica. So these are community operators who it's basically a committee of neighbors who have come up with their own infrastructure. They'll usually have a cooperative kind of structure. Some of them told us that we've looked to private banks at the local level to give us a loan to, let's say, buy a vehicle or invest in our office. However, one of the other findings we had is that the terms of these loans tend not to be advantageous at all. So again, I think that's also limited in terms of the ability of the private sector or private banks to give financing that's more advantageous. But we need to fix these problems with bureaucratic delays to make sure that the operators, community operators, public water operators have the access to the financing that they need. One of the things that also public banks are exposed to are problems with exchange rate fluctuations. Again, that's an advantage of some public banks who are able to lend in the local currency. So it's a cautionary note, but it's also an advantage of public banks. One of the things that we really want to emphasize, however, is that public banks are dynamic institutions. They are operators within financial markets, which means that they're also operating within these markets and face the same pressures of private lenders. And there's a lot of emphasis in the policy literature right now at the United Nations in any discussions of development financing. Most recently, the COP29, for example, the Canadian government announced climate financing initiative of something like about $2 billion. Well, what are they doing? They are pushing market terms. They're pushing blending solutions. And we do think that all of this needs a rethink. The pressure on public banks to treat water and sanitation lending on market-based terms means financialized performance metrics, engaging in private sector de-risking, leveraging and blending. It means support for public-private partnerships and the privileging of cost recovery. And all of these tendencies undermine universal water and sanitation provisioning. Market-based approaches typically increase costs and deliver poorer quality public infrastructure. As far as we are aware, there are few to no cases in the world when we're talking about a large modern water utility that actually has achieved full cost recovery. There is always public investment in a public water system, usually from the government and financed through a series of financial instruments, whether those be loans or bonds. It is a sector in which there is a high amount of risk, and they are lumpy investments, meaning that you need a longer term horizon to make sure that the money can be paid back, because people will and can only pay so much for their water and sanitation services. And to run a utility on cost recovery principles really does punish the people who are most vulnerable in our communities, that is, people who do not have high amounts of socioeconomic resources. So private investor leveraging and de-risking schemes have not delivered the finance at the pace, scale, or terms needed in water and sanitation. So one of the main conclusions that we have based upon the research that we've done is that public bank lending, while not a panacea, is promising in this respect. So what are the promising findings that our case studies revealed? So as I already said, one of the advantages of public banks is that they provide cheap financing, long-term, low cost, and appropriate water sector and sanitation financing. So public banks' lending terms are often superior to private lending terms, and that is because they have the guarantee of the state. The other advantage that we see in terms of the promising findings from the collection is that public banks can help definancialize water and sanitation infrastructure. And this is by lending that respects local interests and quality services over for-profit financial actors' interests. Two of the examples in the collection and the example from Latin America that we highlight is Costa Rica's Banco Popular, which has promoted equity and sustainability beyond financialized metrics in its lending. In fact, the Banco Popular has implemented what it calls a triple bottom line, which means to respect the society impact, the environmental impact, and also the economic impact. Lending in domestic currencies as well is very important because it reduces the exchange rate risks for water and sanitation operators. That's both a risk and a promising finding, as I mentioned earlier. But one of the things that is important for the lending in domestic currency is that the government guarantees are often necessary and vital for these public banks to be able to deliver the concessional financing to water operators on appropriate terms. One of the advantages of public banks that we found is that they are uniquely positioned to grant smaller credits. One of the challenges in water and sanitation is what is called the last mile problem, or el último mil. And that is referring to the fact that often what is most possible is to build the infrastructure, such as the network, build the water treatment plant, build the sewage treatment plant. What becomes difficult in terms of achieving universal access is convincing households to do the last mile connection, because that is the responsibility of the household in most jurisdictions. So public banks have an important role to play here, and we saw this in the Argentina case where the Fond Plata loan was used to hire cooperatives who are working in marginalized areas of Buenos Aires greater metropolitan area. And these cooperatives are the ones who are digging the trenches, laying the pipes. They're being paid, financed through this loan, to connect those households to the networks. And it's a very, very successful example of the smaller scale and what can happen with these credits. And these kinds of solutions are typically what is needed most to make sure that we can achieve universal access to sanitation and water. So public collaborations, there's a role for the multilateral development banks too, or the MDBs as indicated on the slide. So they can boost capacity of local banks because they also possess vast financial resources, but also technical expertise that can be useful. And we saw a number of collaborations between the multilateral development banks and the local banks in this capacity. Also PDBs, which is a public universal bank, and universal bank co-financing. In fact, the case study from Costa Rica, Banco Popular is a universal bank. It is both a bank that provides development kind of financing, but also it's a retail bank where you can have your own bank accounts. And we saw, in fact, the case study that we did in Costa Rica, which was looking at financing these small community water operators that I was describing earlier, was because of a loan that had been offered initially by the Inter-American Development Bank, a public development bank that initiated this entire process. And when the International Development Bank knocked on the door of the Costa Rican government saying, hey, how could we get this loan, or how can we finance water and sanitation? And we want to work with community operators. It was only the Banco Popular who answered that call. And that is one of the origin stories of why they started financing or started a special credit line for small community water operators. And then, of course, there's a lot of possibility for public collaborations amongst different public water operators, or what we call public collaborations in terms of learnings about different questions related to technical capacity raising, etc. One of the things that we learned in the research as well is that there's a lot of knowledge in these banks about the particularities of the sector. And one of the reasons I'll end this presentation talking about FINDETER is that when FINDETER was founded at the end of the 1980s, it was considered to be the water bank in Colombia. And so they have a team, a very vast team. I don't know how many people exactly work for FINDETER in the water section, but they also have regional offices, which will work with water operators in their communities to try to give technical capacity raising to come up with plans for investment plans, for example. And these public banks are knowledge banks as well that have localized capacity and knowledge of the needs of the sector and the local communities. One of the most important aspects of public banks, which is my last point in terms of the promising findings, is that public banks, one of the reasons why it may be advantageous to have public banks rather than direct fiscal transfers is that it's a longer time horizon. So public banks can offer loans at agreeable terms, often the longer the better, 15, 20 years, while a political commitment, we're talking about cycles depending on the country. In my country, it's 5 years. In Mexico, I know it's 6 years. That's a short time cycle in terms of trying to finance difficult and complicated infrastructure that is not difficult and complicated because of the technology involved, but because of the kinds of investment horizons that are necessary to pay back loans on financing this infrastructure. All right, so a little bit about FINDETER before I close here. So again, this is known locally as the Water Bank. It has really helped advance the water and sanitation in Colombia. It was founded on the basis of another bank in 1989. So FINDETER is one of the banks that is featured quite frequently in literature on development financing. And when I was first doing some background research on this bank, why it was praised by actors such as the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank, because they really like the fact that before COVID, this was only a second-tier bank and all of its financing was done through intermediaries. So it was seen as a success case because it was a public development bank that was doing financing, but it didn't take on any of the risk. It passed on all of that risk through its financial intermediaries. So again, I think that's a very conservative way or a neoliberal way to evaluate the performance of a public bank, because it's basically saying that, well, the public sector can invest, but only when it's not going to cost us anything, or that we're too scared to actually invest in things. And so we're going to transfer all the risk to other actors. So during COVID, the government knew that they needed to act fast, because what happened to public water operators during the COVID times is that many countries, such as Colombia, had policies that said that people couldn't leave their houses, quarantines, even the suspension of bill payments in some cases, which of course crippled public water operators because people had an amnesty for not paying their water bill. This was particularly true in the early months of the COVID-19 crisis after March 2020, when we did not understand yet, or scientifically, we did not fully understand how the virus was transmitted. There was a fear that there might be a waterborne aspect. Of course, it turned out not to be the case, but there was an emphasis, and we saw this worldwide, where governments were looking for ways to protect public health and to move money to also make sure that these public water operators could keep operating. And so in the case of Colombia, the government said, okay, Findeted, you were a second-tier bank. Now you're going to be a first-tier bank, or you're going to be able to lend directly to these water companies without having that financial intermediary. So it's a promising approach because it had government backing. The loans were often zero interest loans. There was a loan to the Bogota Water Company, for example, that they had to pay back within, I think it was about 6 months. But again, no interest on this loan. And again, they were able to do that, or Findeter was able to do that because they had the backing of the government. And it really helped move money to help prevent insolvency crises amongst public water operators. Of course, it comes with new risks, because now Findeted can't rely on these intermediaries or these other banks in Colombia through which it was working in partnership before. So it doesn't have the same, the knowledge of those intermediaries in terms of the financial markets. And there's a greater risk of non-payment of the loans that Findeter has had to absorb. But what's really important about this case study, and why we think it's a promising practice overall, is that it's about enhancing the capacity and its expertise to offer lower rates in terms of its loans to continue to expand public water and sanitation in Colombia. And we were also very excited to learn from the researchers that one of the things that Findeted has been contemplating is opening a special credit line to community-based water operators. I'm not as familiar with how water operates in Mexico, but in places like Bolivia, Colombia, of course, because of the failure of the larger state public entities, there are many very vibrant community water operators in Colombia called acequias. And so these are community-run water companies that will treat their own water, pipe water to communities. One of the areas that these public operators that are really community public operators are not performing as well on is usually sanitation, because of course that's an extra cost. And so there's a lot of work to do in this sector in terms of how do we involve these community water operators? Do we integrate them into the formal water network? Do we provide technical capacity and more access to financing to help them upgrade their own systems? Again, lots of questions to be asked in terms of how do we achieve universal water and sanitation for all, and to expand the range of actors that public banks are thinking about in terms of reaching out for these public collaborations, which may be a public community collaboration rather than just public collaboration. So in terms of the next steps, and I'll close on this, and I look forward to hearing questions and comments from Monica and Wesley, is we are doing more research. There's so much to be done in terms of this world of public banks. We're looking for promising case studies of what public banks are doing in terms of innovation. It's very inspiring to do this research for me because I think people react much better to positive stories as academics, and I am speaking personally here. We spend too much time criticizing and not enough time talking about proposals, and it is very important, as I've learned from my Bolivian comrades, to move from protesta to propuesta, and so I do think that this research is in that tradition. It's very important to think about the value of public banks. Public banks were very well respected, very important during the days of the dependentistas in terms of like the national development plans, and then really fell out of favor in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Lots of privatizations. There's a resurgence. But again, I think there's a lot of opportunity for growth, and these institutions are also not perfect. And we need to understand how can we democratize the decisions that they are making so that they are able to respond to a broader array of needs in our societies and deliver socially useful banking services. There's certainly a lot of more room to look at public collaborations as a viable alternative to public-private partnerships, which remain the dominant frame at the global level for how to improve services. And I do think we are going to need more research. And so one of the things that I'm currently doing also with the Municipal Services Project and the Public Banking Project, and I would love to, if anyone is interested in this topic, reach out to me. I'll put my name with my email in the chat. We are looking at practices or promising practices of gender transformative financing approaches. And again, the literature is very limited on this. I have heard from Tom that Bancos is one of the banks that we are going to be doing more research on because they're doing some essentially very innovative things in terms of services for women and girls and thinking about gender and how do we gender our perspective in terms of investing in infrastructure beyond just small and medium-sized businesses. So I will end with that. Thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing more.
Gracias, Susan. Creo que nos dejas digamos, nos abres una discusión muy interesante y sobre todo nos planteas una agenda, ¿no? Que es importante considerar para futuras investigaciones. Le doy la palabra a la doctora Mónica Meireles, ¿sí? Presento a Mónica, es licenciada en Economía por la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas de la Universidad de Sao Paulo, maestra en Integración de América Latina por el programa de posgrado en Integración de América Latina de la misma institución y doctorado en Estudios Latinoamericanos por la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Es autora del libro Crónicas Económicas, que ya va en el volumen 3, me parece. Investigadora titular de tiempo completo, adscrita a la Unidad de Economía Fiscal y Financiera de este Instituto de Investigaciones Económicas, miembro del Sistema Nacional de Investigadores de CONACYT y ha sido responsable de distintos proyectos financiados por el PAPIT. Recibió el reconocimiento de distinción Universidad Nacional para Jóvenes Académicos en el área de investigación en Ciencias Económico-Administrativas 2019. Sin más, le doy la palabra a la doctora Meireles.
Muchas gracias, César. Muchas gracias, Susan, por la conferencia y muchas gracias por la participación en el número especial de Ola Financiera y gracias a Wesley y a Jesús que nos tuvieron ahí al pie del cañón para que el número especial sobre bancos públicos, agua pública saliera, ¿no? Y realmente ese quedó un número muy bonito, muy bien trabajado y esperamos que Susan próximamente nos visite en México cuando pueda, ¿no? Cuando su agenda lo permita. Entonces, básicamente mis comentarios, yo los había preparado sobre el artículo que abre el número especial sobre bancas públicas y agua pública, que es justamente de Susan en coautoría com outro de seu colega, não? Pero também aproveito para estender mis comentários a la plática que nos acaba de dar Susa, não? Primeiro, é justamente lo novedoso del tema em articular as finanças públicas e através de los bancos públicos a lo que seria o financiamento a para lograrse los objetivos del desarrollo sostenible del Acuerdo de París de 2015, ¿no? Entonces, esa idea de justamente vincular el aspecto de las llamadas finanzas para el cambio climático, ¿no? Es súper interesante. Entonces, ahí el editorial del número especial de Ola Financiera habla justamente de cómo los desafíos que la emergencia climática actual viene imponiendo, nos dice que solo 45% de los países firmantes del Acuerdo de París llegarán a alguna de las metas, ¿no? Y entre los que no llegarán están justamente los países más pobres, los países del sur global, las economías periféricas, ¿no? Entonces, la necesidad de justamente ajustar políticas para lograr las métricas contempladas en el acuerdo para 2030, ¿no? O al menos no quedar tan lejos de las metas propuestas, ¿no? En ese sentido, el texto de Susan hace esa creativa vinculación entre lo que es el objetivo 6 del ODS 6, ¿no? Que es el acceso a agua limpia y saneamiento, y cómo la banca pública, ese actor tan importante del sistema financiero, tiene un rol fundamental en posibilitar el acceso al crédito a la infraestructura de saneamiento básico, ¿no? Entonces, ese es uno de los aspectos muy interesantes del texto de Susan y su coautor, y justamente pensando esa dimensión de la banca pública en varios niveles, ¿no? Entonces, un poco como ella también comentó aquí, ¿no? Lo que es un actor potente, que nacionalmente muy conocido, que es justamente la Banca Nacional de Desarrollo, ¿no? Entonces, ese rehabilitar esa Banca Nacional de Desarrollo, justamente ajustando su capacidad de intervención en lo que es las políticas públicas para el financiamiento de infraestructura y saneamiento básico, pero no solo la Banca Nacional de Desarrollo, ¿no? Tenemos una serie de otros actores, ¿no? Como banca subnacional, y aquí Susana estaba mencionando el caso de Findeter en Colombia, que es justamente la banca subnacional vinculada a contribuir para financiar que se logre essas metas, não? E não nada mais, então, mira, estamos nesse nível banca nacional, banca subnacional, que foi um ator muito importante em América Latina, sobretudo em la etapa desarrollista, não? Então, como a banca subnacional foi importante para que justamente se financiara gastos em infraestrutura para a convergência e a integração do mercado nacional em vários países da América Latina, e México, especialmente México, é um caso não muito estudado porque tuvo uma série de bancas, essas bancas subnacionais muito potentes para a integração do mercado nacional e assim potencializar o desenvolvimento econômico del país, ¿no? Y el caso brasileño también, ¿no? Entonces, en el caso brasileño, en la banca subnacional tenemos el caso del Banco del Nordeste, ¿no? Que es un banco que hasta hoy es el principal financiador de la región Nordeste de Brasil, que es una de las más, con su desarrollo relativo más retrasados ahí, ¿no? Entonces, esa banca sigue siendo importante, ¿no? Y también ahora, si vamos un zoom out, ¿no? Si vamos un poco más amplio, la banca multilateral y la banca regional y interregional de desarrollo, ¿no? Entonces, ahí los bancos del BRICS, como un ejemplo de esa banca interregional, la CAF, ahora Banco Latinoamericano de Desarrollo como banca regional para impulsar ese financiamiento de infraestructura, y también lo que son bancos multilaterales, ¿no? O sea, actualizar la agenda de los bancos multilaterales también contemplando esa perspectiva de financiamiento tanto de la mitigación de los efectos negativos del cambio climático como para financiar la transición de la matriz energética, ¿no? También, además del caso específico del acceso al agua, ¿no? Ahora bien, dicho eso, dicho lo anterior, y es uno de los comentarios que quisiera hacer a Susan también, travestido de pregunta, es que hay en la literatura económica heterodoxa essa apreciação de que em época de finanças desreguladas, de neoliberalismo, la banca pública de desarrollo fue muy golpeada, ¿no? Fue muy golpeada y no solo golpeada, como fue de alguna forma empujada a cambiar su modelo de negocio, ¿no? Entonces, estábamos hablando de una banca pública muy potente, con una presencia muy protagónica en lo que era la estrategia de desarrollo nacional en la etapa de los gobiernos desarrollistas en América Latina, pero con el neoliberalismo en la región a partir de la crisis de la deuda externa, mediados de los años 80, 90, y también con esos cambios en el capitalismo a nivel mundial, de la financiarización, de las finanzas desreguladas, hubo esse cambio em lo que era la banca pública, não? Então, esse aí é um texto muito bonito de Juan Carlos Moreno Brito, que analisa justamente esse câmbio para o caso de um banco mexicano que é Nacional Financiera, não? Então, ele estuda aí como Nacional Financiera ha cambiado sua forma de actuar a partir dessa égide del neoliberalismo, ¿no? Entonces, por ejemplo, ¿no? O sea, de ser banco de primer piso a cada vez operar mais tras bambalinas, banco de segundo piso, usando de los serviços de outros intermediários financeiros, sobretudo, que têm maior capilaridade, não? A banca privada e outros intermediários, pero que a lógica de operação não é exatamente afim com o crédito subsidiado ou crédito a fundo perdido que a banca pública de uma etapa de antanho operava, não? Então, esse o caso de Nacional Financiera, a principal produto, a principal linha de crédito actualmente de Nacional é uma linha de crédito para capital de giro, não? Então, já não estamos falando de uma banca de desenvolvimento que está financiando projetos de inversão que tardam em madurar 20, 30 anos, sino que está financiando o capital de giro das empresas mais a curto prazo. Además, essa banca pública, já saliendo já do caso específico de Nacional Financiera, sino que mais como tendência, a banca pública ha sido empurrada a mimetizar certos comportamentos e métricas de rentabilidade da banca privada, não? Então, ao depender menos do presupuesto público e ter que captar recursos, fondear-se em el mercado, isso obriga que a forma de operação dessa banca pública seja também emulando níveis de rentabilidade e outras métricas da banca privada. Então, e a banca pública tem outros princípios, não? Outra razão de ser, não? Então, também no lado da gestão de ativos, não? Justamente para que essa banca pública seja autossustentável, não? Ou seja, não dependa da política pública e do financiamento dos governos, sino que esteja operando de forma mais amigável com o mercado. Essa banca também está fazendo sua gestão de ativos de forma muito parecida a la que hace a banca privada, não? Então, se ponendo parte de sua carteira em derivados e com isso apoiando as fontes de inestabilidade financeira das economias em las que elas operam. Então, era justamente isso que quisiera perguntar-lhe a Susan, não? Sabemos que a banca pública é um ator fundamental em el financiamento a infraestructura para saneamento básico, el acceso al agua. Pero, como, o sea, aparte de los casos de éxito que has presentado aquí, como comentar essa pouca margem de maniobra que a banca pública ha estado teniendo por essa uma gestão de finanças públicas mais mas seguindo as regras do neoliberalismo, não? E a segunda pergunta que também quisiera hacerle a Susan, es pedirle que si por favor pudieras ahondar en el caso de Bolívia, ¿no? O sea, porque el caso de Bolívia tiene un peso tan grande el tema agua, acesso al agua y rumbos de la política del país, ¿no? Yo creo que quizá essa história de privatizar serviços de acesso al agua y de saneamiento, resistência social, cambio de governo, el caso de Bolívia es tan elocuente para falar da transcendência do tema que estamos falando quando falamos de bancos públicos e água pública, não? E, finalmente, também uma última pergunta para Susan, e também comentário pergunta aí, não? Essa última parte, não? democratización del acceso al crédito, ¿no? Entonces, si nos pudieras contar un poquitín más del caso de Banobras que has mencionado y justamente el tema de las brechas de género en el acceso al crédito y qué función tiene la banca pública para también contribuir para la emancipación financiera de las mujeres en América Latina, ¿no? Y una vez más, Susan, muchísimas gracias por tu texto en Ola Financiera y muchas gracias por tu plática en el día de hoy.
Quisiera que... Do you want me to go now, or Wesley, do you want to say something and then I can address both, or how do you want to? Hello? Oh.
Y director del Consejo Editorial de Ola Financiera. Ha participado en distintas conferencias nacionales e internacionales, tiene infinidad de artículos publicados en revistas especializadas y libros colectivos, y es autor del libro México desbancado, causas y consecuencias de la pérdida de la banca nacional. Wes.
Muchas gracias, César. Y muchas gracias, Susan, por estar aquí hoy con nosotros. Me toca el tercer día de esta conferencia, presentación de Ola Financiera. Yo voy a hacer un poco al contrario que Susan. Mientras ella tuvo el buen gusto de presentarlo en inglés, yo voy a tener el mal gusto de que me aguanten mi mal español. Gracias. Nosotros aquí venimos de las finanzas críticas y no el agua. Otros al inverso. Y mientras a Susan le gusta más lo positivo, a mí me gusta lo negativo. Lo digo en media broma. Yo creo que sí es muy importante para una de las grandes quejas contra el neoliberalismo es la no hay alternativa, latina en inglés, y para derrotar este punto de neoliberalismo necesitamos propuestas y buenas propuestas para evidenciar que todas las decisiones son políticas, no es falta de opción, sí tenemos muchas mejores opciones, entonces nos urge seguir trabajando en ese sentido y felicito mucho el grupo en que Susan está participando, están haciendo muy buen trabajo, un muy buen esfuerzo pues esfuerzo político de amarrar fuerzas y aplicar presión sobre gobiernos para que mejoren sus políticas públicas, en este caso sobre el agua, que es muy importante. Hicimos los últimos en los últimos días, hicimos en la UAM, justo por la razón, aquí en Ola Financiera tenemos muchas personas de diversas universidades, que creo que en esa diversidad nos da cierta fuerza y flexibilidad. Pero como tenemos muchas personas que trabajan en la UAM Iztapalapa, justo al tema de agua, y realmente logramos una muy buena complementariedad entre el grupo en que está Susan, justo con David McDonald, Thomas Marois, estaban con nosotros pues otras personas que participaron en el número especial y realmente tuvimos un diálogo muy, muy interesante y fue una muy buena oportunidad para juntar grupos y para mí en lo personal era aprendí mucho sobre el agua y no me gustó para nada lo que aprendí. Es absolutamente, especialmente para la Ciudad de México, es una historia de terror que nos va lo que nos avecina. Y realmente sí estamos, yo creo que la parte negativa, sí tenemos que entender los problemas que nos enfrentan. Yo creo que son mucho peores y más urgentes que luego damos crédito. Estamos frente a, y es como vemos al neoliberalismo. Yo lo veo tal vez con más potencia multidimensional, y que está muy bien que todos estudiamos como sus vertientes, pero yo realmente lo pongo en el cúspide del pirámide y también doy mucho énfasis en ideas y cómo el neoliberalismo nos ha tergiversado las ideas. Una de mis citas favoritas sobre el dinero, y creo que el dinero es lo más importante, es que el dinero es un excelente sirviente y horrible amo. Y el neoliberalismo es subir al dinero a amo y todos nosotros esclavos de dinero. Y ahorita yo soy gran admirador de Polanyi, no porque lo conocí ni nada, sino porque para mí tiene razón más o menos en todo. Y el entendimiento de él es que va a ser la banca global encargado de la misión ideológico, que hoy es neoliberalismo, pero también controla la paz y el funcionamiento de nuestros sistemas financieros. Y estamos viendo el colapso de todo. Estamos viendo el genocidio de Israel contra sus vecinos. Estamos bien, obviamente, en cooperación con Estados Unidos, Gran Bretaña, y luego estamos viendo las medidas que nos están acercando cada vez más al apocalipsis nuclear. Entonces yo creo que no podemos subestimar las fuerzas del mal que estamos enfrentando y que van ganando a galopazos. Menciono todo eso porque urge el cambio de sistema y cambio de mentalidad. Y lo que aprendí del agua, especialmente en el DF, es muy parecido. Tuvimos unas ponencias excelentes. Ojalá todo se puede ver en línea. Creo que en el Redefin van a estar poniendo las ligas, si no están ya. Una de las ponencias que más me impresionó, no es porque lo dio un exrector, pero sí lo dio un exrector, no es apología al poder, pero qué bonito presentación nos dio el doctor Monroy. Y a lo mejor una de las principales conclusiones de él es la forma en que manejamos el agua en el DF tiene sentido si lo vemos por una óptica, y eso es la óptica de la eficiencia de capital. Sí genera dinero la forma en que opera el agua en el DF. No tiene nada de sentido en ningún otro, bueno, la redundancia en ningún otro sentido tiene sentido. Lo que estamos haciendo es transportando enormes cantidades de agua que se nos están acabando muy rápido. Y la cantidad de energía y dinero necesario para este traslado no tan necesario de agua es la lógica del sistema. Si podemos votar, olvidarnos de la eficiencia de capital y ir por otros criterios de éxito, tanto de servicio de agua como de servicios de financiamiento, bueno, es la única posibilidad. El sistema de agua que hemos tenido, mientras genera dinero para algunos pocos, arruinó completamente no quiero decir arruinó, nos puso en un muy mal camino y este camino nos va a llevar a no tener agua. Y estamos muy cerca. Tenemos que cambiar el camino, tenemos que cambiar la mentalidad. Pero para dar fe en qué tanto el esfuerzo que hacen para que nosotros caemos en el criterio único de eficiencia de capital. El trabajo intelectual que las tarifas son malos, que hoy va a venir Trump y va a haber tarifas, qué horror, ¿no? En Ola Financiera tenemos en los clásicos la autosuficiencia nacional de Keynes. Si se acuerdan, en 2008, cuando el precio de petróleo subió tanto, pues tuvimos que repensar todo por 6 meses nada más. Pero la mayoría del tráfico internacional de los buques supercontaminantes es para mover hidrocarburos de un lugar a otro. Estados Unidos exporta un montón de hidrocarburos y importa un montón. No tiene nada de sentido. Elevamos tarifas, por favor, 50%. Elevamos el precio de petróleo, si eso es lo que es necesario para que, como Keynes dice, por favor, consumimos localmente lo que se puede consumir localmente. Y sobre todo, no dejemos que las finanzas sean internacionales, porque nos dicen que las finanzas internacionales garantizan la paz, pero es completamente lo contrario, garantizan la guerra. Y es lo que estamos viendo. Susan menciona, y estoy muy de acuerdo, los varios beneficios de usar la banca pública, pero creo que algo que podemos ir pensando para el futuro es justo esta lógica con lo cual estamos usando las finanzas. Porque la banca actual no solo presta dinero a quien no debe de prestar dinero para proyectos que son socialmente, ecológicamente y económicamente dañinos. Su lógica de selección es pues nos ha llevado a este sistema en pleno crisis, sino colapso que estamos ahorita. No necesitamos finanzas bajo la lógica que me va a hacer dinero. Necesitamos finanzas que sean esclavos a la sociedad, que hacen lo que queremos que hagan. Y hay una enorme flexibilidad en eso que no vemos. Pero por favor, si lo vemos con la banca privada, las marometas, la flexibilidad, que se han operado desde antes, pero especialmente desde 2008. Estamos muy preocupados que la banca pública no genera ganancia, pero la banca privada no tiene que generar ganancia. Generarán enormísimas pérdidas y los fiscalizamos. Terrible hacerlo, pero se pudo, ¿no? Otra cosa interesante de la banca pública es la contabilidad frente a la contabilidad nacional, ¿no? En 2008, el gobierno de Estados Unidos, que tiene sus bancos híbridas, semipúblicas de vivienda, Fannie Mae, la más importante, tuvieron que rescatarlos. Pero no entró en el presupuesto, no entra en las agencias calificadoras, no se carga a deuda nacional. Pusieron 5 trillones de dólares en conservatorship. Nadie sabe qué es eso, pero no aparece en el presupuesto, ¿no? Si tenemos un ciclo financiero, vamos a decir, de un banco público con 20 operadores de agua y lo mantenemos cerrado, este crédito se va a pagar en el largo plazo con el usuario y los operadores de agua. Podemos tener un préstamo de 50 años. ¿Qué importa? ¿Qué importa cuando se paga, la medida que se paga, si lo tenemos aislado del presupuesto federal? Ahí no nos afecta nada. Ni en la contabilidad, ni en la realidad. ¿A quién tenemos que pagar eso tan rápido? Es decir, podemos usar la flexibilidad que han mostrado la creatividad para salvar sus propios pellejos, para salvar nuestros propios pellejos, no de los intereses de los rentistas financieros, pero los intereses de la humanidad que están en oposición diametral con los intereses de la renta financiera, como estamos viendo ahorita. Entonces, perdóname la negatividad, lo digo igual que Mónica a Susan, son comentarios, preguntas, pero luego al escuchar las dos participaciones, me surgen preguntas, dudas. Ojalá eso también puede hacer el mismo efecto. Pero realmente quiero agradecer mucho, mucho, mucho todos aquí, todos allá. Creo que estamos haciendo pues buenos complementos a nuestros estudios, nuestras ganas de entender el mundo mejor para mejorar el mundo. Y ojalá este ciclo que más o menos vamos cerrando hoy sea nada más un primer paso para que podamos seguir colaborando en el futuro. Muchas gracias y gracias por la paciencia.
Gracias, Wes, a los comentarios. Susan, no sé si quieres comentar algo a
Well,
partir de
I will,
las
I could,
observaciones y las preguntas que te realizaron Wesley y Mónica.
sí, ¿me escuchas? Can you hear me? I think, me parece que estoy en. Hello, hello, hello. Hello. Hello, hello. Hello, 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 hello. Is the tech not working? Monica?
Susan, are you there?
I am there. Can you hear me? Oh, yes.
Yeah,
now
we
I
can hear you now.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll just very
So-
quickly address the questions that Monica put forward and say very quickly some things that Wesley said. So Monica's first question was about the limited room for maneuver of public banks. And I think that is true and something we're also concerned about. And it is one of the reasons that we are looking for banks that are doing interesting things that are not thoroughly neoliberalized. And I do think that the Banco Popular is a good example because the credit line that they have extended to community water operators is not only related to the story with the multilateral bank that inspired the initiative, but also because it is the most democratic public bank in the world that has an assembly of 290 members from the community from different sectors who forced the bank in the 1990s, the height of neoliberalism, to open new credit lines that are financed directly from the profits from the bank. And that is actually where the money comes from to finance these community water operators. So again, that's just one example amongst many. What we are endeavoring to do now is systematize these kinds of findings into broader stories. The second question was about Bolivia and about the very serious challenges in Bolivia. And again, I think it's incumbent upon all of us in our communities to look at what kind of financing options are available. I do think that one of the positive things that happened under the first Morales government was to think much more serious about integrating the community water managers, because Bolivia, like Colombia, has a lot of small water committees. And the question becomes, again, about integration versus trying to support the increased capacity of those small operators. I do think that that's one of the ways forward that leads to some complicated situations often about who owns the infrastructure. There has to be compensation. There's resistance from communities, and there should be resistance from communities from even dealing with the public entity, because often the public entity is corrupt. And we have to realize that as well. And for me, the path forward is to push for more democratic forms of management, whether that be in a bank or in a public water company, even in a community water operator. Sometimes you will have problems that are part of working in groups and communities. I mean, democracy is not a thing, it's always a process, and it always has to be renovated again and again and again. We never arrive, actually, I think. So thirdly, Banobras and gender. This is a question that I've opened that I don't have answers for yet, but thank you for raising it. I don't know much about Banobras in particular, but the question was about how can we democratize credit for women? What does that mean for women's empowerment? I think there's been a lot of good work, both critical of microfinance, which has become financialized in many different jurisdictions. I think the work of Lena Lavinas, who's a Brazilian economist, who you see you're nodding your head, has done really excellent work on how in circumstances, particularly we've seen it in Brazil, we've seen it in South Africa, that when you have highly developed credit markets that financialize anything that has to do with the cash payment to poor people is highly problematic. That said, what I would like to find is when is it working well? When has it done things? When has credit actually worked in terms of democratizing credit for women? I'm not against cheap credit for small and medium-sized enterprises owned by women. One of the cases I would love to look at, but we probably won't be able to because of the complications of working in Venezuela, is they had a women's bank run by women economists, for women. I've also heard that they had to write off like 40% of the loans. What's wrong with that? That's one of the questions I would ask. As Wesley was saying, why are we using financial metrics to measure the success of an entity, of a public institution? Maybe that should be the goal. It's simply a grant and not a loan. I know that the Canadian government is financing a whole bunch of private enterprises and writing off those loans. There's a double standard that's emerged because of what we call neoliberalism, judging more harshly public entities for what is just written off as, oh, well, it didn't work out in the private sector, we'll bail them out, right? It's about a rethinking, and I think we're on the same page in that respect. And Wesley has put a lot of those big questions on the table. Of course, somos la gorra de los Estados Unidos, so we're like the hat of the United States. They're our largest trading partner. We are also reeling from the election. Trump has threatened to slap 10% tariffs across the board. That would cripple the Canadian economy. We're all trying to digest what's happening now. But I will say that one of the things that Tom and I have been working on is we just wrote an essay for the Socialist Register about why we think that public banks have to be part of the solution for whatever we're talking about right now, which is a part of a solution. I cannot address rising authoritarianism, even fascism, which I think is becoming a more accurate descriptor of definitely in Europe, rising neo-fascism in the United States, but Canada as well. But if the problems that we're seeing in terms of the dislocation and the fear in communities of the uncertainty that we're facing, both because of environmental changes, migration, racism, we need to address questions that also are about people's fundamental needs, like housing and food, that are not being met. And so there's a vacuum right now that's being filled by the right. And so for me, part of the answer in the next years will be looking at the institutions that exist. I do think that we need to think beyond what exists for inspiration for our politics. But given the urgency of the transition, we make a case in our essay that there are no green and just transitions that are not going to pass through public banks. And so what that means in my community is to think about the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is a bank that the government created about 5 years ago. It has a mandate, which is to push public-private partnerships. What it is doing well is not that, because it turns out the private sector is actually not that interested in bidding on these socially necessary infrastructure projects. What they are doing well is partnering with municipalities, partnering with First Nations to build essential infrastructure, whether that's going to be something related to climate change mitigation, such as energy production in a green or safe way. And so I do think that it's about pressuring and thinking about what in our community exists and how can we make it better? How can we make it serve socially useful functions, or what Marx would call use value, or Polanyi, you would have a word for it in terms of this decommodification that we want to see in our society. I think we need to think and talk a lot more about socially useful banking rather than financial imperatives.
Gracias. Gracias, Susan. Wes.
Susan, si gusta aguantarme 2 minutos, nada más para compartir unas cosas más. Muchas gracias por la referencia a la autora de la microfinanzas. Aquí también leemos mucho al señor Milton Bateman, que vino aquí una vez. Milford Bateman, gracias, Mónica. Yo haciendo anuncios y equivocándome de nombres, perdóname. Él nos estaba explicando hablando de financiamiento de género. Como en muchos países hay finanzas populares. El más popular de los populares en México es la tanda. Cuando la gente agrupa su dinero y una sola persona está encargado, va en rotación. Y luego con el dinero juntado se puede prestar, se puede gastar, pero es finanzas populares. Lo que hace compartamos en un muy mal ejemplo de microfinanzas es mete toda la tanda. La mujer encargada de la tanda va a hacer el enlace al banco y entonces, cobran, según yo, 150% por año de tasa de interés. Y el programa es realmente nefasto porque implica con una persona, la jefa de la tanda, implicas todo tu tanda. Y entonces la jefa de finanzas populares se convierte en el cobrador del banco para los demás a tasas antisociales. Tal vez yo soy ignorante, pero si yo fuera diseñando un programa de Banobras, yo haría lo mismo, pero a tasa cero. Venga con nosotros, ofrecemos garantías, tasa cero tal vez no, 5%. Algo debajo del precio del mercado, tráeme tu tanda y te garantizamos si hay un problema con el préstamo, otra vez. En inglés me encanta la frase, there's the original phrase, the rolling stone gathers no moss. In the bankers change that to the rolling loan gathers no loss. Si hay un problema con el préstamo, extendemos el préstamo. No hay ningún problema. Y como dice Susan, estoy muy de acuerdo. Y si no pagan, es un subsidio. No pasa nada. Estamos ayudando a nuestra gente. Ahora, no hay que dejar que la gente use mal esa confianza. No estamos dando dinero a personas que se van a portar de forma antisocial. que van a robar el dinero. El problema típico cómico con la tanda, todos encargamos la confianza en una persona y se va con nuestro dinero. No queremos premiar acciones antisociales, pero perdonar deudas que sí sirven para la sociedad, pero no ganan mucho dinero, eso sí perdonamos. Estoy muy de acuerdo. Nada más en el punto de las tarifas. Ahora sí, perdón por jactarme, me hice una amistad con Cari Polanyi, la hija de Car Polanyi. Ella escribió el libro The Silent Takeover de los multinacionales gringos a Canadá. Y también recomendación Car Polanyi, The Essence of Fascism. Son términos que debatimos mucho hoy. La definición de Polanyi es cuando los mercados financieros dirigidos por la alta finanza están funcionando bien, su acompañante político es liberalismo. Cuando dejan de funcionar, su acompañante político es el fascismo. Entonces, en mi humilde opinión, todos nuestros gobiernos que antes eran liberales y aguantables, digo nosotros con tendencias tal vez un poco más hacia el socialismo, hacia el anarquismo, pero tolerables, no fueron tan terribles, aunque en el tercer mundo hicieron horrores. Pero hoy que estamos con el colapso de los mercados en 2008, ahí todos estamos hacia el fascismo, ¿no? En fin, va a ser muy doloroso revertirnos a un mundo global dominado por las finanzas, a uno nacional dominado por la producción, pero siempre es que hacemos en una relación abusiva. Terminarlo sí cuesta, pero seguirle nos va a costar más, ¿no? Entonces, nada más para seguir en diálogo y te agradezco mucho los comentarios y el aguante a los míos. Gracias.
Bueno, gracias, Wes. Yo creo que con esto damos por terminado esta mesa muy interesante, ¿no? Y digamos, no pierdo la oportunidad de invitarles nuevamente a que consulten este número especial a raíz del cual surge esta mesa, ¿no? El número 49 de Ola Financiera, que tiene como título Bancos Públicos y Agua Pública, donde justamente los editores invitados fueron Susan, que nos acompaña hoy, David McDonald y Thomas Marua. Entonces, ahí ustedes pueden, digamos, consultar los trabajos a los que se ha hecho referencia en esta mesa, ¿no? Y profundizar en algunos casos específicos, ¿no? A partir de una discusión en torno a uno de los objetivos del desarrollo sostenible que tiene que ver con el acceso al agua. Entonces, pues les agradecemos su atención, los invitamos a consultar Ola Financiera, ya que están ahí, pues tampoco está de más echarse un clavado a los números anteriores, ¿no? Y muchas gracias. Buenas tardes. Thank you, Susan.
Ciao.
Bye.